I'm John Little, and this is the ShockCast.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down, 220 feet. 15 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
The truth about what America created is almost unimaginable. But only almost. If we did not know about other CIA evils, we would dismiss what we are seeing here as just the fevered imagination of an overheated mind. Even so, the horror of what has been done is hard to face. But the cost of ignoring the truth is far too high. So, we must face this. We must also realize that God is just and his judgment for these evils will not be withheld for long. Evil has a price, and it must always be paid in full. I don't think that there are many articles that I have written that are as painful to write as the one that I wrote here. It took me 2 hours of pacing the floor and doing the unnecessary before I could even get myself to make the few mouse clicks that would launch the blank page upon which I wrote. It just is so awful that my soul cries out at the evil that has been done in our name. Paul said to Timothy that the love of money is the root of all evil, and this despicable chapter in America's history is proof of that statement in ways that few could ever have imagined. It is monstrous, a monstrous evil that makes the book of Revelation seem like an obvious result. Who could blame God for destroying so much of the earth when you realize just how evil our governments have been? Of course, you and I know that God is just, so we weren't going to blame God for anything anyway. But to see such a big reason, well, the destruction of Revelation makes complete and utter sense, and this is just one of many, many evils that we are guilty of. However, I didn't come here to talk about God's wrath, but to speak of one of the causes of that wrath, and I've known about CIA involvement in the heroin trade for a long time. The CIA connection to the heroin coming out of Afghanistan cannot be denied. It is impossible that there would be so many other reasons that there would be any other reason than more than 3,000 tons of Afghani heroin are hitting the streets of North America and Europe every year. And only a pitiful amount of it is seized by anti-narcotics police. The CIA connection is the only reason why this trade is so successful. They are able to deflect attention to the source of the trade and the transportation network that delivers it. They are able to deflect attention from the distribution network where heroin-laden transport planes arrive at their destinations. The deafening silence over all this screams of CIA involvement. There is literally no one else that could have done this, and longtime readers have seen me grumble over this for years. And then, a couple of weeks ago, I stumbled over this article, Operation Gladio, the Unholy Alliance between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia, overview of the book by Paul L. Williams. That book review is written by Anthony C. Black, and you can find the link to that article in offguardian.org. And as I said last week, I'm afraid that websites like offguardian.org fail my sanity check every time. And you should never trust people with a mental disease like the one that they have to tell you how the world works. Well, you notice that I'm about to use their Operation Gladio article and go through it because nothing else puts the pieces together so well with so few errors. And yes, we will find errors in this article, but the overall truth is there, and even crazy people will sometimes share valuable facts with you. So let's hold our noses and dive into the cesspool of this article. Note, the website where this article sits has given express permission for anyone to repost the contents of their articles as long as attribution is made. And I did that. So let's start off with the first few paragraphs of this article. Quote, On the hot summer morning of August 2nd, 1980, a massive explosion ripped apart the main waiting room of the Bologna railway station. 85 people were killed and hundreds more injured. Though at first blamed on Italy's legendary urban guerrillas, the Red Brigades, it soon emerged that the attack had in fact originated from within the deep state of the Italian government itself. The full nature of this secret parallel state would only come to light a decade later when the Italian premier, Giulio Andreotti, under questioning from a special commission of inquiry, revealed the existence of arms caches stashed all around the country and which were at the disposal of an organization which later came to be identified as Gladio. The members of this group turned out to include not only hundreds of far-right figures in the intelligence, military, government, media, church, and corporate sectors, but a motley assortment of unreconstructed World War II fascist psychopaths and criminal underworld types to boot. And despite Andreotti's attempts to airbrush the group as patriots, it appeared evident to much of the rest of the Italian polity that these seemed rather more like pretty bad folk indeed. Little did they know, follow-up research by the likes of Daniele Ganser, Claudio Celani, Jürgen Roth, and Heinrich Kruger traced connections to similar groups spread throughout Europe, of which all were found to be deep state terrorist organizations, and all of which were found ultimately to be subservient unto the highest levels of the CIA and NATO command structures. Close quote. One of the reasons why we routinely find out about secret organizations and secret activities is that they routinely screw up. They always overreach, they always grab for more than they can grasp, they always think too highly of themselves and too little of you and me. That bombing was a colossal mistake. They got arrogant and sloppy and blew their cover, literally. And you can bet that most of the Gladio network was forced to disperse and disappear. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at CIA headquarters at Langley while they discussed that debacle. But let's continue on with the article. Quote, the moniker, Gladio, after the two-edged sword used in classical Rome, was eventually broadened to include a bewildering host of related deep-state terrorist structures, including P2 in Italy, P26 in Switzerland, Sveaborg in Sweden, Counter-Guerrilla in Turkey, and Sheepskin in Greece. This hardly definitive European list was then found to have connections not only to virtually every U.S.-sponsored secret state terrorist organization in the world over, including the likes of Operation Condor in Latin America, but also to the many global drug cartels that provided the secretive wealth needed to fund and otherwise lubricate the whole rotting, corrupt shebang. If all this sounds sinister enough, it pales in light of the detailed structure of the dazzlingly diabolical Gladio edifice. This guy writes interesting. Anyway, and it is to those details we now repair vis-a-vis an overview of the remarkable, if otherwise unheralded, 2015 work by journalist Paul L. Williams entitled Operation Gladio, the Unholy Alliance Between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia. Though there are other books on the subject worthy of honorable mention, including Daniele Ganser's seminal tome, NATO's Secret Armies, and Richard Cottrell's recent and stylishly written Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe, it is to Williams that I believe we owe a particular debt of gratitude in having provided a more or less fully integrated portrait of the global machinations of Operation Gladio. Close quote. I'm afraid that I have far less of a glowing opinion of Paul L. Williams than the writer of this review, this article. Paul appeared on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie and made some statements that I personally knew were untrue. It showed that he plays fast and loose with the difference between causation and correlation. Just because you are in the area of a certain thing and might have had some sympathy for a certain thing doesn't mean that you caused that certain thing. Just saying. I hope that made sense to you, but let's not chase that rabbit and get back to our story. And I can definitely confirm that the next paragraph in the article is true. Quote, "Before embarking on our grim, if yet fascinating journey, it is worth first noting that whilst Gladio was officially acknowledged and condemned by the European Parliament in November 1990, Washington and NATO, having ever after refused comment on the matter, and its multifarious organs and factions ordered dismantled, it is hardly likely that the latter was ever fully enacted." Basically, what he's saying is they never took it apart. The historical context of Gladio then is really the quintessential backdrop to the understanding the trademark false flag events of the modern era. To understanding the trademark false flag events of the modern era. Close quote. What an utterly embarrassing and painful coda for those who ran this operation. I'm not sympathetic to their embarrassment. In fact, I mock them for failing so badly. If you get censured by the European Parliament, you have truly embarrassed yourself completely. Here are the next few paragraphs. Quote, "The general origins of this labyrinthine network of deep state actors lay in the so-called stay-behind army set up at the end of World War II by the Allied powers, principally the U.S., ostensibly to act as resistance forces should the Soviets ever decide to invade Europe. Quickly, however, the raison d'etre of the armies transmogrified into a mission to counteract not external invasion, but internal subversion. Such would eventually result in the undermining not just of post-war European socialism, but of Italian, Greek, and later global democracy itself. But we get ahead of ourselves. The primal author of the stay-behind armies, Williams informs us, was General Reinhard Gehlen, the head of German military intelligence during the Second World War. Having foreseen early on that the Reich was doomed to defeat, Gehlen had concocted the idea of forming clandestine guerrilla squads composed of Hitler Youth and die-hard fascist fanatics, ostensibly to fend off the inevitable Soviet invasion. These guerrilla units he referred to as werewolves. Close quote. It is hard to know if this claim by Williams is accurate. It is certainly plausible that General Gehlen was the originator of these werewolves. We certainly know that they existed to combat not only the Soviets, but the Allies too. But whether Gehlen was the origin of the idea or not is relatively unimportant. Someone knew that NATO could not stop the Soviets from invading Europe, should they have chosen to do so. The best that NATO could do at the time was slow the Soviets down until help could arrive from the US and the rest of Europe. The Soviets were always going to win the first battles of any invasion into Europe. And then we move on with the article. Quote, "Not ones to miss a fascist opportunity when they saw it, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, under the leadership of William Wild Bill Donovan, quickly enlisted both Gehlen and SS General Karl Wolff in 1945, in forming the Gehlen organization, later to transform into the present-day German BND, and which received its initial funding from U.S. Army G2 intelligence resources. The American point man on this was Allen Dulles, the first president in 1927 of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and later the first head of the CIA. Duly incorporated into the American fold, the werewolves were given that the werewolves were, given that their initial meddling took place in Italy, rebranded as gladiators. Operation Gladio was born." Close quote. Sorry for my difficulty in reading his writing. This is not completely true, by the way. It was Allen Dulles himself who brought in Gehlen from the cold. Dulles was in Switzerland when Gehlen offered his services to Dulles in return for immunity from prosecution for he and his group of intelligence officers. And the initial statement, in bold on the written part, in this next paragraph is also incorrect. Quote, in 1947, the CIA, having that year superseded the OSS, was faced with its first daunting task, i.e., how to prevent the Italian Communist Party, PCI, from forming the next government. Elections were scheduled for 1948, and the PCI was a virtual shoo-in, not just in Italy proper, but in Sicily as well. Fortunately, Gladio was ready and waiting. The gladiators had been training in a special camp set up in Sardinia, under the local command of the former World War II Italian fascist leader, Prince Giunio Valerio Borghese. Close quote. Sorry, but the CIA did not supersede the OSS. The Office of Strategic Services was shut down and dispersed. It was no longer a trusted intelligence organization, so it was dissolved on September 20th, 1945. Please remember that America was not used to having civilian intelligence organizations. Intelligence gathering was always a part of the military, and each branch of the military had their own intelligence group and still do. Even when the CIA was created, its first two directors were high-ranking military officers. So for 2 years until the CIA was formed on September 18, 1947, there had been no civilian intelligence agency in operation. All intelligence for that period was being handled by various military intelligence groups. I should say foreign intelligence. We still had the FBI. The rest of the quoted paragraph above sounds credible, as well as the next two. Quote, in addition, hundreds of American mafioso began to arrive on the shores of Italy to lend a hand with the communist problem. The arrival of the made men was the result of Donovan's efforts from 1943 onward in working with American mobsters Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese to conjure a few drug funding for the OSS's off-the-books operations and to reinstall the Sicilian Mafia on the island in the lead-up to Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. These forces were now unleashed on the Italian electorate, and through 1948, an average of 5 people a week were murdered by the CIA-backed terrorist units. The results were grimly predictable. Hallelujah, the PCI were defeated and the Christian Democrats returned to power. Still, the threat remained. Fully half of the Italian electorate were communist sympathizers, and, moreover, leftist politics pervaded much of the rest of the diseased European body. More would have to be done. The problem, however, was money. There simply wasn't enough of it. Thus, the initial $200 million in funding for Gladio, which had come from the Rockefeller and Mellon foundations, was quickly exhausted, and though the National Security Act of 1947 had provided the loophole that allowed for the CIA's covert operations, it had not allowed for their overt congressional funding. There lay the rub. Thankfully, Paul Halliwell knew how to salve the itch. Close quote. I spent a lot of time as a teenager reading about World War II and studying the strategy and tactics involved. And it is well known that American and British commanders relied heavily on intelligence and help provided by the Mafia in Sicily. In fact, the Mafia had been running their own resistance campaigns against the Germans occupying Sicily. I just find it to be an interesting coincidence that the second director of the CIA, or DCI, was Eisenhower's chief of staff during the Sicilian campaign, Major General Walter Bedell Smith. Were those connections with the Sicilian Mafia his? Do any of us have time to track all of that information down? No, of course not. So, right, moving on. Oh, and that second quoted paragraph proves my point about the cost of intelligence gathering and covert operations. It's expensive. And it's why so many intelligence websites are complete frauds. One of those websites that I despise the most is Debcafile. Giora Shamis is a lying liar and loves to take your money and give you lies in return. Never read Debcafile. Okay, here are the next two paragraphs. Quote, Paul Halliwell was an inner member of the original OSS along with key scions of the Morgan, Mellon, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, DuPont, and Ryan families. And according to Williams, likely the greatest unsung hero of the nicknamed Oh-So Social Club, for OSS. It was he who, having cut his teeth in the drugs for arms trade by shepherding opium deals with the Kuomintang or Kuomintang, KMT, the Chinese National Army fighting against Mao Zedong, conjured the brilliant inspiration to do the very same thing in the United States itself. Thus, it was at his suggestion that Donovan elected to forge the deep bond and that exists to this day between the nation's intelligence services and organized crime. Enter stage left such notables as Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, and Trafficante, and Gambino crime clans. Quickly, the streets of first New York and later many in American metropolis were flooded with heroin. These early halcyon days would soon lead to the infamous French Connection, thence to the Golden Triangle, where CIA's very own Air America transported drugs out of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, and later to the Balkan, Mexican, and Colombian drug cartels, close quote. All of that rings true, especially the high society elements of the OSS. Society elites have played a big role in the State Department for almost all of that department's history. It is also hard at times to distinguish between the people working for the CIA and those working for state. Both have drawn heavily from Ivy League universities and elite families for their leadership. The next paragraph brings up a question that I alluded to last time or yesterday. Quote, all very well and good, but to begin with, there was yet a fly in the whole drugs for arms for terror ointment, to wit, how to pay off the mafioso without anyone noticing. Indeed, how to stash, launder, and hide all of this financial daring-do from the prying eyes of the authorities. You know, the real enough authorities, the treasury cops, and so forth. How do you do that? Close quote. That last question in the article is the big one, and there are some interesting paragraphs that provide part of the answer. Quote, and he goes on with the Vatican connection. Article 2 of the Lateran Treaty of 1929 was clear and unequivocal. The article, which served to regulate matters between the Holy See and Italian state, expressly forbade any interference of the latter in the affairs of the former. It is hardly conceivable, of course, that the framers of the treaty ever foresaw what such immunity could actually mean in practice. But then they probably hadn't reckoned on the fiendish formation of the Institute for Works of Religion, or IOR, or more colloquially, the Vatican Bank. Established by Pope Pius XII and Bernardo Nogara in 1942, the bank would quickly come to serve as the principal repository post-war both for the Sicilian Mafia and for the OSS/CIA, wherein all of the monies and the documents relating to drug trafficking and to Gladio would be stored and laundered. Already in 1945, the Pope had held private audiences with Donovan to discuss the implementation of Gladio, and where, as Williams reports, Donovan was knighted as an anti-communist crusader with the Grand Cross of the Order of Sylvester. Prior to this time, Pius XII had proven himself a loyal ally in working with Dulles and the OSS to establish the rat lines used to help prominent Nazis escape Europe. Now new horizons beckoned. The first duty at hand, of course, was to destroy the communist menace in respect of the 1948 elections. To this end, the Pope authorized his own terror squads under Monsignor Bicchieri, can't pronounce it properly, to assist the gladiators and the made men in intimidating the Italian electorate. Task accomplished. The second duty at hand, however, was longer term. Communism, socialism, and indeed any godless form of progressive government anywhere had to be stamped out at source. For this, money would be needed. Lots of money. Untraceable money. Drug money. Now, in the months before the 1948 election, the CIA deposited some $65 million into the Vatican Bank. The source of these monies came from heroin produced by the Italian pharmaceutical giant Schiaparelli, and which was then transported by the Sicilian mob into Cuba, where it was cut and then distributed to New Orleans, Miami, and New York by the Santo Trafficante family. Lucrative though this trade was, it was not nearly enough to suit the needs of the CIA and Gladio. More would be required, more drug networks, and more banks. Gladio was about to go global. Close quote. We have a lot of information easily available that confirms these three paragraphs. It certainly makes sense that they would initially depend upon the Vatican Bank to help distribute the funds for their operation. The next part is where we see the KMT that I talked about last time, where they come in. Quote, to start with, a new alliance was forged with the Corsican Mafia. Unlike the Sicilian mob, the Corsicans had extensive experience in processing heroin, a skill that they had picked up through years of working with Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese technicians in French Indochina. A supply route then emerged running from Burma through Turkey to Beirut and thence to Marseille. Alas, there was a slight hitch when the leftist dockworkers in Marseille, being sympathetic to the rebel army under Ho Chi Minh, refused to load and unload the boats from Indochina. No worries, a deft bit of terror administered by the Corsican boys and funded by the CIA. And the problem was solved. By 1951, then, Marseille had become the center of the Western heroin industry. Voila, the French connection. Meanwhile, Wild Bill Donovan had resigned from the CIA to form World Commerce Corporation, World WCC, whose primary function was to facilitate the arms for drugs deals with the KMT. Paul Halliwell lent a needed hand at the helm by heading up Sea Supply Incorporated, a CIA front company gainfully employed in shipping heroin from Bangkok. In 1958, the whole operation was so successful that a second supply route was established running through Saigon. Here, the help of Ngo Dinh Diem, the U.S.-installed despot of South Vietnam, proved invaluable. Close quote. By the way, he was Catholic, very much so. Remember that the CIA purchased Civil Air Transport, or CAT, from Claire Chennault in 1950. So they had a secure way of getting heroin from the KMT in the Golden Triangle to Bangkok. From there, it was easy to get the heroin to Europe. Remember that the KMT were expert in the manufacture of morphine and heroin. So it makes a lot more sense for the heroin to be manufactured on the spot in the Golden Triangle. But that might be an unwarranted conclusion on my part. This next paragraph is where we see how the CIA started to manage the concealment of their drug running. Quote, still, there was a potential cloud on the horizon, i.e., word of all these shenanigans was bound to leak out. What to do? The first reflex, naturally, was to pin the blame for the West's growing heroin problem on the Communist Chinese under Mao Zedong. Check. The second, more considered response was to organize an ongoing campaign to deflect attention away from and burnish the image of the CIA. And to this end, in 1953, did the CIA establish Operation Mockingbird. Under Mockingbird, the agency recruited hundreds of American journalists to spread false stories and propaganda about the company's benign activities. Eventually, this depraved fabric of anti-journalism enlisted entire news networks, including ABC, NBC, Newsweek, Associated Press, and the Saturday Evening Post. I'm losing my mind. Now, the guys and gals at Langley could relax. Henceforth, American and global eyes were dutifully prismed through the rose-colored lens of Mockingbird. Close quote. Remember that there's money involved, lots of it, so capturing the media and then American politicians would have been a major priority. This next paragraph brings us deeper into the Vatican connection and what I hope is a massive typo. Quote, but back to the Vatican. The IOR, solid banking pillar of the Gladio community that it was, could hardly be expected to do all the heavy lifting itself. After all, the global heroin industry would, by 1980, be pulling in a cool, and here's where I'm hoping the typo is, $400 billion annually. En route to an extensive and orchestrated financial network would be required to supplement God's bank, i.e. the Vatican Bank. As with any fine orchestra, it helps to have a maestro of exquisite genius to run the show. A nice round of applause then for one Michel Sindona. The biography of Sindona begins humbly enough with his degree in tax law from the University of Messina in 1942, after which in quick succession he rockets to stardom as a leading financial advisor to the Sicilian Mafia, an agent for the CIA, and thereafter a financial intimate of the Holy See, meaning the Pope. By the late 1950s, Sindona had become the linchpin in a nexus between the mob, the CIA, and the Vatican that would eventually, as Williams chillingly puts it, result in the toppling of governments, wholesale slaughter, and financial devastation. Close quote. Whoops. We either have a typo, or the writer of this article has lost his mind. Or the situation is so huge that, well, I don't have words to describe it. I'm mentally struggling to see how the CIA was making that much money, $400 billion, from the heroin trade in 1980. $400 billion in 1980 would have been a sizable fraction of the world GDP, which was $11.1 trillion at that time. Was the global heroin industry worth 3.6% of world GDP? To put it into another perspective, the GDP of Italy was about $483 billion in 1980, and depending on how you calculate inflation, 400 billion is about 1.2 trillion today. If you use the more accurate figures published by Shadowstats, we are closer to 2 trillion in heroin sold in just 1980 alone. 2 trillion. I have seen figures that indicate that the world drug trade today is close to that 3.6% of global GDP figure. But I don't know if we can apply today's figures to 1980. Did the CIA have complete control of the global drug trade in 1980? Was the global drug trade worth 3.6% of global GDP back in 1980? If the answer is yes to both questions, then the CIA is a lot bigger than any of us have ever imagined possible in our worst nightmares. We're talking trillions of dollars made by the CIA. My mind is already blown by what I'm seeing so far, but I'm still struggling to grasp the idea that this much money was flowing through the hands of the CIA every year. So if anyone has any better data on the total value of the heroin and cocaine trade in 1980, please let me know in the comment section. I want verification. But let's get back to looking at the article. In fact, I'll skip over a few paragraphs of minutia to get to these two. Quote, "This points up a general operating procedure of the entire Gladio banking system, i.e. the system, far from being designed to turn a profit, was expressly designed to lose money. That is, to have it siphoned off into covert ops. Such explains the regular and spectacular failure of a host of CIA-related banks, including Franklin National Bank, purchased by Sindona, Castle Bank and Trust, Mercantile Bank and Trust, both set up by the ubiquitous Paul Halliwell, Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, and from which funds were diverted to undermine Prime Minister Gough Whitlam during the Vietnam War, and infamous Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, based in Karachi in aid primarily of the Southeast Asian heroin trade. Indeed, it was precisely the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano itself that brought forth Calvi and Sindona to their untimely ends. Finally, it is worth noting here that these august institutions were linked in a tight criminal embrace with many of the most prestigious financial firms in America, including Citibank, the Bank of New York, and the Bank of Boston, The base of the iceberg, in short, extended far and wide. But then, what was all this money really doing? Close quote. I actually knew a couple of shady characters who had been involved in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. One or two of you might as well. I'm looking at you guys. For one of them, if you shook his hand, you'd want to count your fingers to make sure that you got them all back. And who knows, the two characters I'm referring to might have been lying about their connections. Lying is easy. Anyway, the point is that the CIA was creating banks and then blowing them up, figuratively, when their usefulness was over. But there was this last question that is the most intriguing. But then, what was all this money really doing? Now that is the question. And the next paragraphs of this article don't really answer it, but there is something interesting here. Quote, following the thwarting of Italian democracy in 1948, the Gladio secret armies entered into a period of what one might characterize as pregnant incubation. Thus, it was during the 1950s that various drug supply routes and financial networks were being created, as were some of the principal political organizations. Probably the most important of the latter was Propaganda Due, otherwise known as P2. Created in 1877 as a Freemasonry lodge for the Piedmont nobility, it was banned by Mussolini in 1924, only to be resurrected post-war with the approval of Allen Dulles himself. Or should I say, himself a 33rd degree Mason. The lodge, though at first dominated mainly by spooks, spies, military, and mafia figures, would soon encompass a who's who of Italian political, corporate, banking, and media supremos, to boot. Indeed, the organization would eventually spread shoots throughout Europe as well as North and South America, and its members would come to include such luminaries as Henry Kissinger and General Alexander Haig. Kissinger. A P2 denizen of especial significance was Licio Gelli. The latter's pedigree was impressive. A former volunteer in the 735th Black Shirts, or 735th Black Shirts Battalion, a former member of the elite SS division under Field Marshal Goering, and thereafter a chummy employee of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps of the Fifth Army, working with William Colby, the OSS agent in France, and Allen Dulles, the OSS director. Gelli soon gained entry into the Vatican, where he helped set up the Nazi escape routes to Argentina. His ties with Argentina would later prove critical in facilitating Operation Condor, the U.S.-backed mass assassination program in the 1970s and 80s South America. Moreover, in 1972, Gelli would emerge as P2's supreme worshipful master, under whose leadership the lodge would reach its full horrific flowering. Finally, it is worth mentioning at this juncture that it was as a result of a police raid on Gelli's villa in 1981 that the full tentacled structure of Gladio would come to light, but we digress. Close quote. Some of you are probably looking for a connection to the Illuminati in all of this. If it's there, you will find it at the Masonic Lodge called P2. It has its fingers deep in a lot of surprising places, and most surprising of all, in the Vatican itself. I've been hearing rumors about this lodge for decades, so I'm sure that there is a lot of very interesting dirt tied into that secret society. The next 8 paragraphs connect Gladio to the horrendous terror campaigns of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're important, but not for our story, so I'm skipping them. This next one might be the most important of all. If the details are actually truthful. Quote, the high-level intrigue did not stop at the murder of the Prime Minister. However, at least 2 popes felt the sharp end of the Gladio sword as well. In August of 1978, Pope Paul VI died. His successor, the preternaturally timid John Paul I, soon gave his handlers a very real shock when, after looking at the IOR reports, or the Bank of the Vatican Bank reports, or accounts, I should say, he issued a call for reform. The very next day, the otherwise fastidiously health-conscious pontiff, in office barely a month, was dead. Not just dead, but expired with the telltale bulging eyes and horrific grimace of acute poisoning. His autopsy was definitively thwarted by an illegal and hastily contrived embalming, and his personal papers disappeared without a trace. Archbishop Marcinkus, having been temporarily removed prior, was returned to office, whilst Calvi in Sindona was under scrutiny at the time. Well, they breathed a temporary sigh of relief, close quote. It should be clear to anyone with more than half a brain that Pope John Paul I was murdered. The only question is, was it really the CIA that did it? Basically, the author is claiming that the CIA controls the Vatican, or at least a large element within the Vatican. I find that assertion hard to believe, but anything is possible when lots of money is flowing through your hands every year. The author compounds the claim with this next paragraph. Quote, having been almost burned once, the overseers of Gladio made sure to engineer the follow-up papal succession. Thus did Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, Polish, shuffle on to the historical proscenium as Pope John Paul II. Now, at first, John Paul worked seamlessly with the CIA and Gladio. Together, they oversaw the destruction of liberation theology in Latin America, the continued undermining of Italian democracy, and the dispensing of black funds for solidarity in Poland. But how the best laid plans do oft go astray. By the spring of 1981, not only were events spinning out of control, but Gladio itself. But so too were they for Banco Ambrosiano, and by extension the IOR, or Vatican Bank. The Pope inexplicably refused to act. Compounding this lapse was an unaccountable trifecta of moral turpitude that witnessed the Holy Father suddenly breaking into treasonous song singing the benefits of the rapprochement with the Soviets, recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and IGAD's nuclear disarmament. The order from on high was given, kill the Pope. Close quote. And when you say Gladio, you are saying the CIA. Yes, other intelligence agencies are involved, but the CIA is the head of them all. Is the CIA really picking popes? To figure out if this is possible, I did a search for how much the Roman Catholic Church is worth. The best answer I could come up with is billions. And I used to believe that billions was enough to answer the following statement. The Catholic Church is the biggest financial power on earth. It's actually a title for the piece that I was looking at. I actually lived most of my life believing that this was true. It's not. I was wrong. After 70 years in the drug trade, the CIA is worth many trillions of dollars. They have complete control of the heroin industry. They own it. They own it so much that no one can so much as talk about it. In comparison, the Roman Catholic Church is only worth billions. That's chump change compared to the CIA. The rest of the article goes on to talk about how Pope John Paul II suffered an attempted assassination, along with the realization of who was behind it. But I think that we've seen enough. Please, think about what all of this means. If the CIA eclipses the biggest financial power on earth, then the darkness at the heart of America is so very much worse that it staggers the imagination. And its name is the Central Intelligence Agency. Oh, and to give you an idea of how important the drug money would be to the CIA, their official annual budget today is less than $20 billion a year. If they are making hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars every year, that official budget is a drop in the bucket by comparison. So, I wonder yet again, what are they doing with the money? Hey, you like that video, right? Great. Click like and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. Then go to the next level. Subscribe to the Shock Letter at theshockletter.com and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Now, read my book, Ezekiel's Fire, at ezekielsfire.com. Why? Because Ezekiel's Fire is coming.